that governs the procedures by which these agencies grant permits and all that stuff. So that good news that you raise is temporary, but it's good news. It shows that there is this element still inside the country, which just happens to be the majority, that doesn't agree with these things. And so what we're faced with right now is we're faced with an extraordinary situation where the clear majority of people in the United States are completely opposed to these type of things being done, yet they're still being done. And the right wing of the Republican Party, or I guess that's duplicative, the Republican Party, the right-wing Republican Party, is attempting to alter the entire structures of our government. They're actually trying to take advantage of this temporary seizure of power that they've exercised here to gain long-term control of the institutional structures of our country. Okay? So the resistance, not just resistance that has to be generated to this, but the alternative positive vision has to be enunciated so clearly and has to be mobilized on behalf of so effectively that they're sorry they ever tried to do this. Because what they've done is they've actually made it obvious what it is that they want to do. And so for many, many years, the Republican Party was kind of successful in kind of obfuscating what it is that they were doing. And a lot of these horrible consequences they thought were just kind of, accidental or inadvertent. But they're intentionally doing this stuff all the time, And now you got a guy in there who is such a simple-minded reductionist that he simply just says it. Yeah, what's wrong with that? Why don't we just do it? What's all the complicated stuff? And so now he's putting it right in our face. And what it's doing is it's exposing the fact that the regular Democratic Party has been going along with this stuff for decades and letting it happen. And now they're being confronted by it. And now you see the regular Democratic Party looking a little bit like deer in the headlights in the face of this stuff going on. And they say, well, just wait till the next election. Yeah, let's leave this guy in for another 2 years and see what's left when he gets done. And so what I'm saying is that I want us to follow what's happening here. I don't want you to have to get way down in the weeds on either one of these two major reports. I just want you to understand the big pieces. That you've got an attorney general, Jeff Sessions, being simply just fired by the president, and the Democratic Party shifting from one foot to another, going, well, I guess he's got a right to do that. I guess we've delegated the authority to the president to be able to just dismiss his attorney general sort of whenever he really wants to. And now you've got the Mueller writing this report that even if he has the almost unrestricted power to dismiss an attorney general like this, if you can show that he's done so for corrupt reasons, which is to pursue his own private interests. And he even goes to the point of simply to protect himself against criminal charges. He's offered half a dozen kind of gratuitous opinions here in this report that weren't necessary at all to his ultimate findings, but he said them anyhow. And he said, for example, that if in fact a president were in fact getting rid of his attorney general simply for the reason of protecting himself against criminal charges, that would qualify as a corrupt motive. And then the Congress could impeach him for having exercised that power corruptly. And they've even gone to the point of saying the same thing about his pardons. He went out of his way to point out he's got a whole, because in here, another thing that you're going to find out that you didn't know about before is that apparently there was a meeting between the lawyers for Cohen and his partner, the other guy that was his partner. I can't remember his name right now, but their lawyers were meeting with Trump's White House lawyers, and what they kept saying over and over again, don't worry, don't plead, you'll be taken care of. That's what he said. You'll be taken care of. Don't worry, you'll be taken care of. Okay? And so Mueller goes on and on here talking about dangling pardons in front of witnesses to attempt to keep them from telling the truth or to try to get them to lie. And he's also got the testimony in here directly from, what's his name, his White House counsel, what's his name, McGahn, Don McGahn, testifying that Trump told him to lie to the government officials, to lie to the special prosecutor, lie to them. Don't admit to them that I told you to fire Mueller. If they ask you, don't tell them. You know, I mean, flat out ordering his White House counsel to lie to the special prosecutor. Okay? And yet he hasn't been charged. He hasn't been criminally charged by Mueller. And Mueller tells you why. Because of this White House Office of Legal Counsel opinion that he can't indict him while he's in office. And he goes on, pointing out how, but I want to make it clear that you can certainly impeach him and you can prosecute him after he gets out of office. And he goes on and talks about it and cites cases about how you can do this. So, I mean, there's a regular roadmap here prepared for the Judiciary Committee and the opponents of Trump as to how to go about doing this. And so what I'm saying is that it's going to make it much harder now for Pelosi and Schumer and Joe Biden. And now with Kamala Harris is going to back up and get into that just because she thinks she's going to be vice president with Joe Biden. You know, they're all, and the others you're going to be able to see if you want to watch the 17 candidates now for the Democratic presidential nomination. Those that are going to be backing away from potentially impeaching Trump are the ones who are campaigning to be vice president with Joe Biden. And those who are going to step forward and say, no, I think he ought to be impeached based upon the evidence that's here, those are the ones that are going to be potentially challenging Bernie Sanders for the nomination inside the Democratic Party to see who's going to be the one who's the major competitor to Joe Biden. That's what's happening right now. Okay, and now those are important dynamics that are going on as to who's going to be president of the United States, you know, for the next 4 to 8 years as of 2020, and whether or not the Justice Democrats are going to be able to disempower Trump by going after him and moving hard to impeach him, you know, if they're going to do that. And I think Nadler is so PO'd now. At Barr and what Barr did in trying to dissemble and lie and distort for the American people, that he may well have come across the line now where he very much wants to impeach Trump for what he's done. And I think that there's enough ammunition here in these two reports to support such articles of impeachment. And so that it poses the big main question we're going to have to deal with here. And it's a subsidiary of the question that you asked, which is, you know, wasting all this time. If you go up to the Senate and they're not going to convict him anyhow, you know, why should you go through all of that? You're wasting all the time that you could have done on other kind of legislation and stuff. The most important thing it's going to do is if they can push this to a vote in the House of Representatives, you're going to be able to identify any of the Democrats who won't vote for the articles of impeachment so we can remove them in 2020. And in the Senate side, all of the Republicans that vote against the impeachment, that you can target those people and then just pour on the evidence in their Senate district, in their state contest, saying, here's the evidence against Trump, and this guy wouldn't vote to impeach him. Now, that doesn't mean you do that in red states. I mean, you're not stupid. You're not going to go in and try to, but look, I mean, they took Alabama. I mean, the Democrats actually won the Senate seat in Alabama. That's because they put up this pedophile maniac sheriff, you know, as the candidate on the other side. But you know, you can always bet on the Republicans to put up some real Lulus, you know, in some of these races. But what you're in the midst of right now is a major surge on the part of your generation to move into positions of power and influence in the United States government structures through the Justice Democrats to basically start stopping global climate change and trying to set up an entire new era in American politics, okay? So that's why I think this thing is so important. And so that I'm not asking you to pull down, all 400 pages of this and read them, but I would ask you to take a look at that video that most of you haven't looked at yet, that I put on the interactive syllabus, the one that's called Epic Times Spygate, because you're going to see the full-scale, articulated, deep state conspiracy articulated here. And if you want to see the opposite side of that, then it's here in the 400 pages. But you're going to see there'll be 2 or 3 specials, no doubt, over the next week or 10 days on MSNBC, possibly Frontline may have a big full special on the Mueller report of revealing the key things in a structured and organized way that make it really easier to understand. Okay? So why don't we do it? Why don't we just start having a bunch of questions and stuff that we've got the all office hours, they call them, that start in another 20 minutes anyhow. But we can just ask some questions. We can talk about all this stuff, and then we may be able to get out earlier if you run out of questions. I think the Democrats, both the new, more moderate Democratic Party and the Justice Democrats were all surprised at how limited the redactions were in this report. I would say that 96% of the report is here. So it's not so much just the redactions that are at issue here. It's the evidence supporting the 95 or 96% of it that's all in the open here. What did the interviews actually say when you interviewed? They've interviewed hundreds of witnesses. For example, they've got they refer to in a couple places. I'll have to take a look. But it says when Trump was first notified that Rod Rosenstein had appointed a special counsel, he said, "Oh fuck, I'm fucked. My presidency is over." And so, well, who said that? I mean, who said he said that? I mean, who was there when he said something like that? I think he's going to have a pretty good idea who else was in the room when he said that, and what's he going to do about that? But the regular Democrats want to know, what did all these people say? What additional evidence did you have? Because the more you get down into those details of the evidence, the harder it's going to be for Pelosi to think that this guy shouldn't be removed from office. Okay? So that I don't think it's the redactions itself. From a procedural point of view, the regular Democrats are going to make a big stink about here, give me the redactions. Except they're such institutionalists. They're going to say, oh, you say it's grand jury information? Okay. I don't want to interfere with that. Oh, you say it's protecting sources and means and sources? Oh, I don't want to do that. Because I was a prosecutor, and I too am strong on law and order, and they're going to say, oh, national security. Oh, sure. I don't want to. So they're going to posture a lot about that stuff, but they're not going to make a lot of war about that. They're going after the backup documents, okay, mainly to drag things out and to get the record fully replete. And as you saw, what Mueller said is we did this full report, even cognizant of the fact that we probably couldn't return criminal charges against him in order to preserve the evidence. I mean, that's an extraordinarily telling statement that he makes right at the top of page 1, about why he did this. Okay, so I think that the difference between the redacted copy and getting all the redactions removed, they're not, plus the other ones, other cases that are being prosecuted. They're going to say, oh, good, prosecute some more people. So I don't think that's going to make the big difference here. The big play is whether or not they're going to be supporting impeachment or whether they're just going to be digging out more evidence under the theory of we have to know everything that's happened here. Not as long as he's in office. Well, yeah, if he's impeached, well, you just got to he's impeached by the House, unless and until he's convicted, he's not removed from office. He's just impeached. And then he has to go up in front of the Senate, and then there's a big trial in the Senate. And the staff from the House of Representatives comes over, and they'll probably bring in a lot of Mueller's people to help prosecute in the Senate. Okay, and then if he's convicted by the Senate, then he's automatically removed from office. And then the vice president would come in and would take his place, unless impeachment procedures have been begun against him as well because of what's been revealed during the investigation, which might happen with regard to him. That's right. That's right. Well, no, not a criminal case, but an impeachment. Because one of the things, there's a spot, I haven't found it yet in here, but because they cited the wrong page when they were talking about it on MSNBC, but said that the Judiciary Committee in the House and Senate has the right to, in effect, criminalize conduct that isn't even subject to a present criminal statute for the president. They can make it a high crime or misdemeanor for him to have done certain kind of things, like, for example, the refusal to see that the laws were fully and faithfully executed. There's no criminal statute on that, but it's his oath of office. And if he didn't do it, he can be convicted of that. So it's not, there aren't just a criminal standard, it's an impeachment standard. No, it's just but the fact is, he could conceivably be impeached. Yes, yeah. Any presidential appointments can be impeached. You know, there's a certain set of them that are cabinet members can be impeached. And they've already, even Swalwell has made bold to suggest that he resign. And that came right out of the chute. And so I think you may get some calls here, and it might be cool to get him impeached first, you know, to kind of exercise their muscles and get him impeached, then pull him up in front of the Senate and have a trial. So that's he can be impeached too. Okay, so look, on Tuesday, I'm going to have a little bit more, just some specifics for us to deal with, and then I want to be talking about how I believe that the issue of global climate change is analogous to the Vietnam War that really undergirded the entire dissolution of support for Nixon. And even though he was impeached on the burglary and other things, it was that huge undermining of his popularity and support among the American people for a fundamental violation of fundamental constitutional concepts that caused his impeachment. And so I want to talk about that on Tuesday. Okay? So look, have a good Easter holiday, I guess, and let's see each other on Tuesday, okay? Yeah, if anybody has any other individual questions, you don't have to, I know that you've asked questions here, but no, there are limitations on this. And not only that, but the nation states that actually exist right now are largely the function of major capital financiers that kind of created these boundaries. You look all through the Middle East, you look at the states, but what you really need to look to is bioregions. Bioregions exist naturally. They're in the kind of the tributaries around different bodies of water, and that there are cultural peoples, there are tribal peoples that have a certain solidarity. You know, this artificial stamping of nation states all across the world and seeing who's in charge of those things, you know, is not anything that's entitled to great respect. You know, but the indigenous communities, genuine tribal people and stuff that have long cultural traditions and stuff, those things need to be respected. But the nation state is an artifice of the Treaty of Westphalia, you know, among royal classes. So you don't get too excited about the nation states.
Okay. Well, so you have solidarity for the indigenous communities, but how would you reconcile indigenous communities fighting for their own nation state?
Well, I think that's a function of boarding schools. Is you get people, you know, I had Francis Hecrow, for example, a wonderful guy, Lakota Natchaa guy, that he took a position that in order to be a Natchaa, which is a long traditional thing in the Lakota people, protecting the community, you have to be married in the church. So that's just from having your mind poisoned by being in the schools. You know, the fact is there's all kinds of amalgamating of these old ideas and stuff like that. But the fact is that there's sovereign territory that the people have. They never, as you know, they never had a sense of ownership of the land. So the indigenous people, they had certain hunting areas and fishing areas, and they had relationships. For example, the Great White Roots of Peace, the Akwesasne, the Five Indian Nation Confederacy, they had relationships with each other, and that they knew they had certain hunting grounds, and they would share hunting grounds, etc. So there's long traditions in which people can get along without having these ironclad nation-state boundaries. And so I had this long discussion with Russell Means. Russell, came forward. I was his lawyer for a long time. That he came forward with this thing of establishing the Lakota Nation and saying this is our territory. And you looked at the 1858 treaty and the 1851 treaty. Those are all creatures of the white government. And to fall prey to say, okay, we're going to say we have a nation state that's made up of the boundaries that were recognized by the United States government in 1851. That's that same problem. So the question is to what we do, what type of alternative natural law structures ought we to have to engage in self-government, and how big ought the regions to be? I mean, it's always kind of peculiar that people 3,000 miles away can tell you in some detail how it is you have to live. That's that thing that happens down in the South. You go down New York, people come down and say, you can't have segregated schools, and they tar and feather you and kill you and everything else that they did back in the 60s. And and you can see that you can get out of touch with this thing of coming, parading in and telling people how to live and stuff even though you come from long distance away, you're not part of their community, et cetera. So what we have to do is you have to dig down, try to determine what type of natural law principles actually function in nature, and how do we accommodate ourselves to these natural laws. What effect does that have in for example, bartering and exchange, growing food and keeping your water clean and stuff like that? How do you make collective decisions in the community? This is a course that's going to talk about a lot of those kind of things. So I appreciate the question. This thing we talked about there being this spectrum of worldviews that people have that range all the way from authoritarian to reactionary to conservative to moderate to liberal to progressive to utopian, et cetera. There are whole worldview belief systems that go on behind that stuff. And so we have to explore that to figure out how to work our way up out of this thing. The early classes we have like this are just trying to get you in tune with some of the big pieces of things that are going on in the culture right now, so that you can see that this deeper dive that we're going to do on worldviews and natural law principles and how do you construct a just world in light of the fact that we know how unjust it is now. So we can thank Trump for making it as clear as possible how unjust things can be, all right?
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com with Propaganda Watch for this week. And don't let it be said that I'm up on a high horse pretending that I myself am immune to the propaganda constructs that are out there. We are all prey to them from a very tender young age. And I've managed to dig up off of my hard drive some of my old poli-sci papers from back when I was at the University of Calgary. And I had almost forgotten about this class. I took a poli-sci 283. I don't even know exactly what that was. I guess it was something to do with international relations with a Dr. Eunice. I don't even remember his full name at this point. I guess I could look it up, but I'm not that motivated. The only thing that I really remember about that class is Dr. Eunice telling us a story once about when he was talking to Henry Kissinger about something or other, and I remember at the time I was thinking, ooh, Henry Kissinger, wow, this guy's important. Yeah, it's a bit embarrassing. These papers that I dug up and printed off here are embarrassing on a number of levels. First of all, as a self-confessed logophile like myself, this is pretty bad writing. I am surprised, actually. I was going through my various papers, philosophy papers and English papers and things, and by the second, third year of university, I started to hit my stride, and it's at least readable. But this, which is more from my first, second year, is just cringe-inducing. Some really horrible sentences and constructions in here. I mean, even disregarding what I'm actually writing about, just some of the sentences are terrible. What was the worst one I found? This sentence is just... Historically, the language of science has proven to be one of the only truly universal languages in the world today. Really, James? Historically today? Really? This is bad. This is bad. You don't understand how this is the most embarrassing thing I could do, is to dig up my old writing and share it with you. But I will do so in the interest of showing, not telling, but showing how propaganda affects the minds of the young. And let's look at a couple of the papers that I wrote from that class. Now, over 2 decades ago, 21 years ago, April 6, 1998, I wrote this little gem, The United Nations and Developing Aid. Oh yeah. Which starts by saying, in recent years, developing aid has become a multifaceted topic, no longer simply involving monetary handouts to impoverished countries. As usual, the United Nations is at the forefront of the movement to provide diverse forms of aid to developing countries, fulfilling the promise made in the United Nations Charter to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, and for those ends to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advantage of advancement of all peoples. In their attempts to deliver efficient and effective aid, the United Nations has set up the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, an organization which directs the United Nations' attempt to promote sustainable human development throughout the world. This program works to make effective changes in developing countries to promote the betterment of all impoverished peoples. Woo, quite the thesis statement there, James. Yeah, this sounds like a press release for the United Nations, doesn't it? And yeah, the paper pretty much reads that way. It's just full of just gunk about and fluff about how great the United Nations Development Program is. And it ends up on this note. What then does the future hold for the UNDP? Interestingly, a key issue affecting the organization's future is that of program funding. Originally, all the funding for UNDP-related activities came from voluntary contributions from nearly every country in the world. However, in 1983, the Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean was informed by the indicative planning figure that core funding for programs was being reduced. The result is that non-core funding, such as joint efforts with government or industry, now accounts for more money than core funds in the region. The switch to non-core funds is now being encouraged throughout all of the UNDP's main areas of operation, as it decreases the organization's dependence upon unreliable contributions. The concern has been raised, however, that the association with bodies that do not subscribe to all of the United Nations goals and priorities will dilute the effectiveness of UNDP programs. When governments and industries help to fund the UNDP's activities, they must have a say in what those activities are. This, obviously, can lead to conflicts of interest, whereby the co-funding agent promotes its own development goals at the expense of broader assistance to all parts of society. Whether these concerns have genuine merit is yet to be seen, and will be studied more carefully in future human development reports issued by the UNDP. An interesting bit of hand-waving at the end there. Well, here's this issue about, well, maybe there's people who are funding these programs that don't necessarily have the interests of all of society at heart. Really? Yeah. And then, the entire paper ends with, in conclusion, the United Nations is at the cutting edge of assistance to developing countries. The UN has realized that simple monetary handouts are not an effective way to help encourage growth in the third world. Accordingly, many different issues are now being addressed by various UN agencies, including the UNDP, to raise the standards of living in impoverished countries. Much progress has been made in these matters, but much remains left to do. And as long as there is work to be done in developing aid, one can be assured that the United Nations will be helping to provide it. Wow. And then my works cited list is literally every single work cited comes from the UNDP homepage. Great sourcing there, James. Every single thing cited. I mean, this is just the UNDP press release. I don't remember what the actual specific assignment was for this paper, what we were supposed to be doing, but literally, this is just regurgitating the UNDP site and saying how, don't worry about all these problems, whatever they are, the UN will sort it out. In my defense, again, I think this is just a reflection of the propaganda constructs I was living in as a young child growing up in Canada, subjected to such things as the Heritage Minute, talking about Canada's proud heritage and UN peacekeeping and other such things, which is why I think early on in the podcast, I did come back to this point several times, that the United Nations is not your friend. The United Nations is not there to help you. The United Nations is not all warm and fuzzy, because I had grown up so much with that propaganda ringing in my ears. The United Nations is wonderful, and Canada has been a core part of peacekeeping and other selfless acts on the international stage, blah, blah, blah. That propaganda nonsense really got, I think, into my head, which is why when I started to learn, hey, maybe that's not true, that really was something I hammered home. But perhaps the more interesting paper for our purposes is this one, Global Forces and the Coming Millennium, April 20th, 1998. So just a couple weeks after that UNDP press release I wrote. And this one starts, on the brink of the new millennium, world politics seems to be resting on a precipice, poised between the traditional nation-state system and an increasing trend toward globalization in many international matters. The rise of this trend towards globalization can be traced to several key transnational movements. How these forces are dealt with in future world politics might just determine the future of our nation-state system forever. Well, there you go. Pretty apropos to the subjects that I'm still here talking about 21 years later. So let's see what I had to say at the time. This is where I came in with that historically today sentence. We live in a society since the dawn of man. Yeah, I'd like to think I was always a great writer, but well, we all have to start somewhere, right? Well, here's actually some interesting bits from this. I start by talking about science and technology and how they're going to be important for developing and international relations and blah, blah, blah. The international language of science has historically today been very important. But I have a section on eco-politics, where I note the increasing popularity of environmental consciousness in international politics has created such international organizations as Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund. And if you want to know more about the World Wildlife Fund and where it really comes from, how about Why Big Oil Conquered the World? Such occurrences as thick smog, which have become a common occurrence in some major urban centers, show the need for environmentally friendly thinking. Environmentalist thinking has become such a large concern to industrialized countries that the United Nations has organized Earth summits to deal with some of the larger issues. I would also recommend Why Big Oil Conquered the World if you're interested in the Earth Summit and what it was really about. While many environmentalists see this as progress, developing countries tend to argue that the conferences concentrate on sustainable environmental development, which puts them at an unfair disadvantage to the developed world. They argue that while the developed world was allowed to industrialize free of environmental restraints, the industrial countries are now frowning on the third world for doing the same thing. Such complaints are justified and must be addressed. I believe it is important for the burden of helping the developing countries attain environmentally friendly development fall on the industrialized world. That is a nonsensical sentence. Maybe I'm trying to say, I believe it is important for the burden of helping the developing countries to attain environmentally friendly development. I don't know. I'll let you parse that sentence. I think I understand what I'm saying, but it's not even really English. It is unfair to put already struggling countries at a further disadvantage by asking them to shoulder the economic burden of cleaning up their industries. Making such ultimatums only leads to mistrust and discord on the global political scene. Something that has been a common and repeated point of contention in the annual Conference of the Parties meetings at the UN, talking about the climate issue and who's responsible for it and who's going to get money for it. It's all squabbling over the money and the handouts, and this has continued to be for the last 21 years now an important key issue. and one that I've addressed before in my reporting on ClimateGate, for example, back in 2009 at the Conference of the Parties, where one of the major concerns raised by the developing world is, hey, how come you guys are trying to put the limits on it just as we are industrializing? But then I go on to say the importance of ecopolitics as a force in the 21st century, however, may not be very large. Already, support for environmentalism seems to be waning as citizens become more informed on what the real global environmental situation is. The dreaded greenhouse effect, for example, which has dominated media attention for years, does not seem to be quite so dire as doomsayers originally predicted, if it is even having an effect at all. Recent studies of solar flare cycles may discredit the theory forever, and if so, the impact on environmentalism as a future political force would be profound. Furthermore, the public is becoming more aware of how organizations such as Greenpeace use scare tactics and media coverage to mainstream their own agendas in international politics. The realization that such organizations may distort the truth in order to win widespread support for their environmental program recommendations may also hamper the furtherment of ecopolitics. All right, well, hey, point there, James. I even at that time, even 21 years ago, it was becoming obvious that there might be a political agenda that's at work here, more so than unbiased and objective scientific reporting on the facts as they stand. And even talking about solar flare cycles and other things as being drivers of climate. So that's interesting because I didn't really seriously start questioning the consensus on climate change until 2006. But even back in 98, I guess I still had my misgivings, which was interesting. It was interesting to see that. And then moving on in a section on international agencies and transnational affiliations. Organizations like the United Nations, on the other hand, attempt to transcend ideological and cultural differences as well as national boundaries to bring order to international relations. The United Nations has been the major player on the international scene for over 50 years now, but its inefficiencies are now beginning to show through. It suffers from the same type of problem which crippled its predecessor, the League of Nations, namely an inability to enforce decisions. With no standing army, there is no way to ensure the enforcement of military decisions. As peacekeepers, the UN plays mainly a figurehead role, and is largely ineffective should large-scale hostilities resume. It has set up a court of international law, but settling disputes there is completely optional and results are not binding. What needs to be done to promote world peace and order in international relations is to give the UN more power in enforcing its own decisions. Giving the UN this kind of control, though, means nations relinquishing some of their own autonomy. Such submission has not reached widespread appeal with the citizens of the world, however. Militias... unnecessary apostrophe, which have been formed in the southern United States, for example, see the United Nations as little more than an attempt to form a one-world government and thus destroy the US's world supremacy. Similar sentiments, albeit to lesser extents, pervade much popular thought. Until such selfish thinking can be adjusted, there will never be the realization of true world peace and cooperation. Until we can eliminate anyone who disagrees with us, there will not be peace. There's a lot in here that clearly is not coming from 19-year-old me. It's clearly things that I was steeped in from a very young age, and it's interesting to see the way this spills out on the page here. I will direct people to my podcast episode on international law for more about that concept of international law and how it is furthered, fostered, and promoted by entities like the United Nations, and was fostered and promoted in the New World Order of Wilsonian diplomacy in the League of Nations. I'll also direct people to my film literature New World Order episode on Pink Cadillac, which don't watch the movie, but listen to the episode. It's about the militia movement and how it was set up to take the fall for OKC, essentially. And the FBI operation that was going on behind that, the PatCon and all of that. That's an incredibly interesting thing, and especially resonant for me, because as I was even writing about in here, militias in the southern United States? I thought it was the Michigan militia that was the one that was the big boogeyman, but anyway. it was still, I guess, resonated enough for me to be writing about it in one of my term papers here 21 years ago. And there you go. So propaganda sinks deep and it regurgitates itself, perhaps when you least expect it. Then I write about the future of world politics, talking about the global polyarchy and blah, blah, blah. This leads to the rather obvious statement that money will be a large concern of countries in the 21st century, you think? However, as the European Union begins to organize and perhaps dominate the global economy, they will be setting the trend for other countries to organize large, highly profitable free trade common currency zones. One thing is sure, and that is if the United States begins to lose its position as the economic superpower to beat, it will be desperate to adopt new measures to restore its prominence. As the environmental movement starts to lose support for the aforementioned reasons, it will leave behind one important legacy. The idea of ecology seems to be inextricably linked with the idea that all mankind is truly one. And since the whole global environment is so related, and we're all in the same boat, so to speak, perhaps petty differences such as skin color should be forgotten. Only when man begins to recognize he is not fundamentally different from his enemy will the world achieve peace. Whenever the future begins, one can be assured, whatever the future brings, one can be assured it will be an interesting time politically. As transnational forces begin to rise to prominence, it's anyone's guess as to how traditional forms of governance will adapt. I will note even the use of the word governance is a reflection of propaganda poisoning that I've been subjected to, because of course that is the word that the globalists love to use. It's not global government. Oh, what are you? You're part of one of those militias who's afraid of the United Nations. No. We're talking about governance. It's totally different, guys. Anyway, well, at the very least, I cited 4 completely different sources as my work cited in this paper, none of which are the UNDP website, so some slight progress, huh? Anyway, this is me bearing my my innermost vulgarities to you, in every sense, the terrible writing and the ridiculous regurgitation of nonsense propaganda. But again, I think it is important to just show and to demonstrate that, of course, I don't hold myself up on a high horse in this. We're all swimming around in this propaganda stew, and it sinks in there, and then it comes up on command when it's needed to, in whatever academic or other context in which this stuff is brought out. So I just wanted to share that with you and, atone for my sins of this putrid nonsense that I was spewing out a couple of decades ago, with some links to some of the Corbett Report work that I've done in the intervening decades that hopefully mitigates the propaganda that I was spewing back then. And now that I have an audience, now I can actually spread truth rather than spreading propaganda to a probably very disinterested professor who may have half-heartedly marked these papers. I don't even know what I got on them. I don't remember. I don't care. But anyway, that's that. And that's going to do it for another edition of Propaganda Watch. If you have any embarrassing papers from your undergrad time, please share them with the audience. I'm sure we'd all love to hear about them too. In the meantime and in between time, I'm James Corbett at CorbettReport.com. Looking forward to talking to you again very soon. When World War II ended and the American deep state welded the national security establishment into place with the National Security Act, the world entered into a new era. The era of the military-industrial complex. But when the Cold War ended and the clash of civilizations became the new existential threat, the deep state found an opening for another paradigm shift. As the all-pervasive threat of terrorism became the carte blanche for total surveillance, the powers that shouldn't be found the organizing principle of our age would not be military hardware, but data itself. Welcome to the age of the information industrial complex. This is the Corbett Report. Of all the things that President Dwight D. Eisenhower did during his years in office, it is for a single phrase from his farewell address that he is best remembered today: the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
It is not difficult to see why these words passed so quickly into the political lexicon. Think of their explanatory power. Why did the US use inflated estimates of Russian military capabilities to justify stockpiling a nuclear arsenal that was more than sufficient to destroy the planet several times over? The military-industrial complex. Why did America send 50,000 of its own to fight and die in the jungles of Vietnam, killing untold millions of Vietnamese, not to mention Cambodians? The military-industrial complex. Why did the US use the public's fear and anger over 9/11 and a phony panic over non-existent weapons of mass destruction to justify the illegal invasion and trillion-dollar occupation of Iraq? The military-industrial complex. Why did Nobel Peace Prize laureate Obama expand the fictitious war on terror into Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia, refuse to close Guantanamo despite his earlier promises to the contrary, commit US forces to kinetic military action in Libya without so much as seeking congressional approval, and launch a new era of covert drone warfare? The military-industrial complex. Why has Trump not only continued but further expanded the US military presence in Africa, increased US aid to Israel and Saudi Arabia, actively enabled the war crimes in Yemen that have led to the largest cholera outbreak in human history, and killed more civilians in his first 6 months in office than former drone king Obama killed in his entire 8-year presidency? The military-industrial complex. When you think about it, it's rather remarkable that such a phrase was ever uttered by a president of the United States, much less a former 5-star general. Could you imagine any modern-day president talking about something like the military-industrial complex and its attempted acquisition of unwarranted influence without immediately dismissing the idea as a conspiracy theory? Over the decades, there has been much speculation about Eisenhower's use of the phrase and what precisely he was warning against. Some have argued that the phrase was prompted by Eisenhower's discovery that the Rand Corporation was grossly misrepresenting the Soviets' military capabilities to John F. Kennedy, who ended up using the Rand-invented and completely fictitious missile gap threat as a cornerstone of his 1960 presidential election campaign. Whatever the case, it is perhaps time to revisit Eisenhower's most famous speech. What Eisenhower is ultimately describing is the rise of American fascism, the merger of government and corporate power. What term can better capture the nature of early 21st century American political life? Is there any longer any doubt that the military-industrial complex has reached its ultimate expression in firms like Blackwater, aka G, aka Academy, and its military contractor brethren? Is there any other word but fascism to describe a state of affairs when a Secretary of Defense can commission a study from a private contractor to examine whether the US military should be using more private contractors, only for that same Secretary of Defense to leave office and become president of the company that conducted the study, only to leave that company to become vice president of the US and begin waging a war that relies heavily on no-bid contracts awarded to that same company based on the recommendation that it made in its original study? Yet this is precisely the case of Dick Cheney and Halliburton. It would be difficult to think of a more blatant example of the military-industrial complex fascism that Eisenhower was warning of. But as it turns out, there was another warning about fascism embedded in that farewell address that has received far less attention than the military-industrial complex formulation, perhaps because there is no catchphrase hook to describe it.
Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers.
Given that this warning came in 1961, before the age of communication satellites or personal computers or the internet, it was a remarkably prescient observation. If scientific research half a century ago was dominated by federal grants and expensive computer equipment, how much more true is that for us today, half a century later? So what is the problem with this? As Ike explained,
Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
here again, the warning is of fascism. But instead of the military-industrial fascism that dominated so much of the 20th century, he was describing here a new fascistic paradigm that was but barely visible at the time that he gave his address. A scientific technological one. Once again, the threat is that the industry that grows up around this government-sponsored activity will, just like the military-industrial complex, begin to take over and shape the actions of that same government. In this case, the warning is not one of bombs and bullets, but bits and bytes. Not tanks and fighter jets, but hard drives and routers. Today we know this new fascism by its innocuous-sounding title, Big Data, but in keeping with the spirit of Eisenhower's remarks, perhaps it would be more fitting to call it the Information Industrial Complex. The concept of an information industrial complex holds equally explanatory power for our current day and age as the military-industrial complex hypothesis held in Eisenhower's time. Why is a company like Google going to such lengths to capture, track, and database all information on the planet? The Information Industrial Complex. Why were all major telecom providers and internet service providers mandated by federal law to hardwire in backdoor access to American intelligence agencies for the purpose of spying on all electronic communications? The Information Industrial Complex. Why would government after government around the world target encryption as a key threat to their national security? And why would banker after banker call for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to be banned, even as they plan to set up their own central bank-administered digital currencies? The Information Industrial Complex. The effects of this synthesis are more and more felt in our everyday lives. Every single day, hundreds of millions of people around the world are interfacing with Microsoft software or Apple hardware or Amazon cloud services running on chips and processors supplied by Intel or other Silicon Valley stalwarts. Google has become so ubiquitous that its very name has become a verb meaning to search for something on the internet. The 21st century version of the American dream is encapsulated in the story of Mark Zuckerberg, a typical Harvard whiz kid whose atypical rise to the status of multi-billionaire was enabled by a social networking tool by the name of Facebook that he developed. But how many people know the flip side of this coin? The one that demonstrates the pervasive government influence in shaping and directing these companies' rise to success, and the company's efforts to aid the government in collecting data on its own citizens. How many know, for instance, that Google has a publicly acknowledged relationship with the NSA? Or that a federal judge has ruled that the public does not have the right to know the details of that relationship? Or that Google Earth was originally the brainchild of Keyhole Inc., a company that was set up by the CIA's own venture capital firm, In-Q-Tel, using satellite data harvested from government Keyhole-class reconnaissance satellites? Or that the former CEO of In-Q-Tel, Gilman Louie, sat on the board of the National Venture Capital Association with Jim Breyer, head of Excel Partners, who provided $12 million of seed money for Facebook. Or that in 1999, a backdoor for NSA access was discovered in Microsoft's Windows operating system source code. Or that Apple founder Steve Jobs was granted security clearance by the Department of Defense for still undisclosed reasons while heading Pixar in 1988, as was the former head of AT&T and numerous others in the tech industry. The connections between the IT world and the government's military and intelligence apparatus run deep. In fact, the development of the IT industry is intimately intertwined with the US Air Force, the Department of Defense, and its various branches, including famously DARPA, and, of course, the CIA. A cursory glance at the history of the rise of companies like MITRE Corporation, Oracle, and other household electronics and software firms should suffice to expose the extent of these relations and the existence of what we might dub an information industrial complex. But what does this mean? What are the ramifications of such a relationship? Although the signs have been there for decades, perhaps the most startling example of what lies at the heart of this relationship has been revealed by the whistleblowers at the heart of the National Security Agency, one of the most secretive arms of the American intelligence apparatus. While Edward Snowden has received the most attention with his revelation of the PRISM program, much of the information about the NSA's ability to surveil all electronic communications has been revealed over the past decade by NSA whistleblowers like Russ Tice, William Binney, Thomas Drake, and J. Kirk Wiebe, third-party contractors like Snowden and AT&T whistleblower Mark Klein, and independent journalists like James Bamford. Together, the story they tell is of a truly Orwellian society in which all communications are being captured and analyzed by the NSA and, with the advent of facilities like the new data center in Utah, presumably stored indefinitely for use at any future time in any future investigation for any pretense by anyone with authorization to access that data. According to Snowden, this includes lowly third-party contractors like himself, operating at NSA subcontractors like Booz Allen Hamilton in the vast and expanding private intelligence industry that has grown up around the information industrial complex in the exact same way as private military contractors like Blackwater formed around the military industrial complex. In some ways, this information industrial complex is even more insidious than its military industrial counterpart. For all of the ills caused by the military-industrial complex, and there are many, at the very least, it required some sort of excuse to drain the American people's resources, and its failures, like the Vietnam quagmire or the debacle in Iraq, happened in the clear light of day. In the information-industrial complex, where vast spying programs happen in the shadows and under the cover of national security, it takes whistleblowers and insiders willing to risk it all even to find out what is being done by these shadowy agencies and their private sector contractors. Even worse, the entire Orwellian spy grid is being run on the flimsiest of pretenses, the war on terror, that has no defined endpoint and justifies turning that spy grid inward on the American people themselves. Surely Eisenhower never envisaged the monstrosity that this information industrial complex has become, but the foresight he saw in identifying its early stages over half a century ago is remarkable. The problem is that we are even further away from heeding the warning that he delivered in that 1961 address than we were at that time.
It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society.
If only this was the rhetoric that was shaping today's debate on the issue, instead of the well-worn canard that we must strike a balance between freedom and security. Sadly, until such time that the National Security Act of 1947 is repealed, and the cover of national security is lifted from the dark actors that populate this sector, the information industrial complex is unlikely to be quashed, or even hampered, anytime soon.